My new son-in-law, Kevin, stood proudly at his wedding reception, a smug smile on his face. To impress his powerful boss, he gestured toward me and announced to the room, "And this is my father-in-law, Walter. He's an unemployed loser, but he has a good heart." Kevin expected a chuckle from his CEO. What he got was a cold, knowing smile that could freeze the Texas sun. In that single, breathtaking moment, my son-in-law's entire future began to unravel, and he had no idea that I was the one holding the scissors. Before I explain how that simple introduction led to his ultimate downfall, let me know where you are listening to this story from in the comments below. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel if you believe a person's character is worth more than any job title. The first red flag appeared 3 months before the wedding. We were at an upscale steakhouse in downtown Austin, the kind of place where the air smells of leather and success. My daughter Jessica was glowing, her eyes fixed on her fiancé Kevin. But I was watching him. He spent most of the dinner bragging about a recent sales bonus, flashing a new Rolex that cost more than my car, and detailing his plans to buy a German luxury sedan. I tried to steer the conversation toward something more meaningful. I asked him about his plans for a family, about the values he wanted to build a home on. He just patted my hand with a dismissive air. "Walter," he said, his voice laced with a condescending sweetness, "times have changed. Financial security is the foundation of happiness." He glanced at my simple, reliable watch, the one I'd worn for 20 years, and a small smirk played on his lips. I mentioned that I was enjoying my retirement after a long career in supply chain management. Kevin simply nodded, his eyes already scanning the room for someone more important to talk to. To him, my quiet life was a sign of failure. I saw the warning sign clear as day. For Jessica's sake, I chose to ignore it. That was my first mistake. The second red flag was even bigger, and it waved proudly during the wedding planning. I had a simple suggestion. There's a beautiful botanical garden just outside the city, a place where my late wife Clara and I used to walk. It has a charming old pavilion surrounded by rose bushes. It was meaningful, elegant, and affordable. I offered to cover the cost as my wedding gift. Kevin listened to my idea with a patient, strained smile. When I finished, he cleared his throat. "That's a very quaint idea, Walter." He said the word quaint, landing like a small insult. "But Jessica deserves a real dream wedding. Something memorable. Something her friends will talk about for years." He then unveiled his own plan, a lavish ceremony at an exclusive golf and country club with a price tag that made my eyes water. "Don't you worry about a thing," he added, patting my shoulder. "I've got this covered." And it wasn't an offer of generosity. It was a power play. He was telling me that my contribution, my memories, my values were not welcome. His vision for the wedding wasn't about love or family. It was about performance and status. I saw Jessica's face caught between her father's sentiment and her fiancé's ambition. She looked at the glossy brochure for the country club, her eyes wide with excitement, and in that moment I knew I had lost the battle. I stepped back once again, choosing silence to keep the peace. The final warning, the one that should have made me scream from the rooftops, came a week before the wedding. I had found the courage to speak to Jessica alone. We sat on the porch of my small, comfortable home, the same home Kevin had subtly mocked. I spoke gently, choosing my words with care. I told her I was worried about Kevin's focus on money and appearances. I asked if she was truly happy. Jessica sighed, a sound heavy with frustration. "Dad," she said, her voice strained, "you just don't get it. Kevin is ambitious. He's a provider. He wants to give me a life that you couldn't." The last part was left unsaid, but it hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. She continued, "You're happy with your quiet retirement. That's fine for you. But we live in a different world with different pressures." Her words stung more than any of Kevin's insults. My daughter, the girl I had raised to value kindness and integrity, was now defending a man who possessed neither. She saw my simple life not as a choice but as a failure. She had bought into Kevin's worldview completely. I realized then that to fight against him would be to fight against her. And so for the love of my daughter I surrendered. I promised to support her and to be on my best behavior at the wedding. I didn't know then that my best behavior would involve watching her new husband humiliate me in front of the one man he should have feared most in the world. The next warning sign came a month later, a bright red flag planted firmly in the middle of the wedding planning. The three of us were gathered around my small kitchen table buried in a sea of glossy brochures and expensive stationery. I had waited for the right moment to pause in the discussion about floral arrangements and color palettes to make my own suggestion. I pushed a modest pamphlet across the table toward them. "I have an idea," I began, my voice filled with a hope I hadn't realized I was holding on to. "The old botanical gardens by the river. It has a beautiful glass pavilion surrounded by rose bushes that your mother always loved, Jessica." I looked at my daughter, trying to convey the weight of the memory. "It's where Clara and I celebrated our own 20th anniversary. It's quiet, it's timeless, and I would be honored to cover the entire cost as my gift to you both." For a moment, Jessica's face softened. I saw a flicker of the little girl who used to love hearing stories about her mother. But the moment was fleeting. Kevin picked up the pamphlet, holding it between his thumb and forefinger, as if it were something distasteful. He studied it for a second, before placing it back on the table with a strained, polite smile. "That's a very quaint idea, Walter," he said. The word quaint was a verbal pat on the head, a dismissal of everything I had just offered. Before either of us could respond, he slid a heavy embossed brochure into the center of the table. The cover showed a sprawling, perfectly manicured golf course under a golden sunset. "Now this, he said, his voice booming with pride, "is a wedding venue." He tapped the photo. "The Oak Ridge Country Club. It's exclusive. It makes a statement. Jessica deserves a dream wedding, a day that her friends will be talking about for the next 10 years. Something they'll be jealous of." He then looked at me, his eyes holding a mixture of pity and triumph. He leaned forward and patted my shoulder, a gesture that was meant to seem friendly but felt deeply condescending. "And don't you worry about the money, Walter. I've got this." He wasn't offering a gift. He was marking his territory. He was telling me in no uncertain terms that my contribution, my memories, and my sentimentality were not only unnecessary, but unwelcome. He was buying my silence, paying to have my old-fashioned values removed from the picture. I looked at Jessica. She was staring at the glossy photos of the country club, her eyes wide with the manufactured dream that wasn't her own. She was captivated by the image of perfection Kevin was selling. I saw the conflict in her, the quick, silent battle between her father's heartfelt memories and her fiancé's glamorous ambition. And I saw who won. She looked up at Kevin and smiled a brilliant, dazzling smile that broke my heart. "It's incredible, honey," she said. I knew then that I had lost. So I simply nodded, leaned back in my chair, and let the wave of their plans wash over me. For the sake of a peace I was beginning to realize was entirely one-sided, I once again said nothing at all. The final warning, the one that should have made me put my foot down, came about a week before the wedding. I had invited Jessica over for dinner, just the two of us. We sat on the back porch of my small, quiet home, the same home Kevin had subtly mocked on more than one occasion. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn, and for a moment it felt like old times. I decided to make one last attempt. I spoke carefully, keeping my voice gentle. "Honey," I started, "I know how much you love Kevin. I see it. But sometimes I worry. His focus on money, on what other people think, is that really what will make you happy deep down?" I reached for a memory I knew we both cherished. "Your mother used to say that you build a life with character, not with cash. That integrity was the only thing that would keep you warm when times got tough." Jessica was quiet for a long time, tracing the rim of her water glass with her finger. When she finally looked up, her expression wasn't soft or contemplative. It was defensive. A wall had come up between us. "Dad," she said, her voice strained with a frustration that was clearly not new. "You just don't get it. Kevin is ambitious. He's a provider. He's working hard to give me a wonderful life, a life with security." She took a breath and delivered the line that felt like a physical blow. "You're used to your quiet, retired life. It's fine for you. But you don't understand the pressure our generation is under. The world is different now, more competitive." Her words meant to defend, her fiancé felt like a judgment on my entire life. She saw my simplicity not as a choice I had earned, but as a failure to keep up. She saw the peace I had built as a lack of ambition. In that moment, I realized with a heavy heart that my daughter was speaking with Kevin's voice, seeing the world through Kevin's eyes. She had mistaken his materialism for strength, and my quiet contentment for weakness. To argue further would be to drive a wedge between us right before the most important day of her life. It would have made me the villain in her story. So I did the only thing a father could do. I surrendered. I reached across the table and took her hand. "You're right." I said the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Your happiness is all that matters to me. I'll support you whatever you choose." I forced a smile and she smiled back, relieved. The wall between us came down, but I knew it was only because I had agreed to stand on her side of it. I walked back into the house that night, feeling a profound sense of loneliness, knowing that I had to let my daughter walk into a storm and pray she would be strong enough to find her way out. The wedding day arrived, painted in the brilliant, unforgiving light of a Texas morning. The Oak Ridge Country Club was just as Kevin had promised, a sprawling monument to manufactured perfection. The lawns were impossibly green, the flowers were artfully arranged, and a string quartet played softly in the background. It was a perfect picture, but the groom himself was a frantic smudge in the middle of it all. While I tried to soak in the moment to feel the joy of my daughter's special day, Kevin was a storm of nervous energy. I watched him from a distance, pacing near the entrance, constantly glancing at his Rolex. He snapped at a waiter who was a second too slow in refilling a water pitcher. He glared at his phone as if it had personally offended him. He wasn't a man celebrating love. He was a project manager on the verge of a nervous breakdown, terrified that his meticulously planned event would have a flaw. I found a moment of peace talking to my cousin Martha, who had flown in from Oregon. We were laughing about a childhood memory, a silly story about a fishing trip from 40 years ago. It was a genuine, uncomplicated moment of connection. And that, of course, was when Kevin saw us. He strode over, his smile as tight as a drum. He didn't greet Martha. He didn't even acknowledge her. He just put a firm hand on my arm. "Walter, can I borrow you for a second?" he said, his voice low and urgent. He pulled me away from Martha's confused expression and steered me into a small, empty alcove near the coat check. His grip was surprisingly strong. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive cologne and anxiety. "Look, Walter," he began, his eyes darting around nervously. "Just a heads up. David Sterling, my CEO, is going to be here any minute. This is a huge deal for my career. So please, no stories about fixing leaky faucets or the fish that got away all right." He paused, looking me up and down, his gaze lingering on my simple, classic suit. I need you to be presentable. Just smile, nod, and let me do the talking." And there it was. Not a subtle jab, not a veiled insult, but the raw, unvarnished truth laid bare. He was ashamed of me. Ashamed of my life, my stories, my very existence. All my quiet sacrifices, all the times I had bitten my tongue for the sake of my daughter's happiness had led to this. To being told to be a silent, well-dressed prop in his corporate drama. I felt a cold, hard clarity settle in my gut. I looked at this panicked, shallow man and saw him for exactly what he was. I simply nodded. "I understand, Kevin. I said, my voice calmer than I felt. I wouldn't want to embarrass you. The moment finally came. The heavy oak doors of the grand hall swung open, and a hush fell over the crowd. The string quartet swelled, playing a melody that was supposed to signify joy, but to me it sounded bittersweet. On my arm, Jessica was a vision in white, beautiful and radiant, but I could feel a slight tremor in her hand. All eyes were on her, but my world had narrowed to this single precious moment with my daughter. Just before we took our first step down the long aisle, I stopped her. "I have something for you," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. From my pocket, I pulled out a small, simple silver locket, its surface worn smooth with time. It wasn't flashy or expensive. It was far more valuable than that. I pressed it into her palm. "This was the first gift I ever gave your mother," I told her, my eyes meeting hers. "I gave it to her this day we signed the papers for our first small business loan. We had nothing but a crazy idea and each other." I could see the tears welling in her eyes, and I knew she was truly listening. "Your mother always said that real value isn't in a bank account," I continued, my voice barely audible over the music. "It's in what you build together, with your own two hands and your whole heart. She would have wanted you to have this today." For a heartbeat, the wall between us disappeared. She was my little girl again. She clutched the locket to her chest, her fingers tracing the worn edges. "Oh, Dad," she whispered, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "It's beautiful." It was a perfect moment of connection, a reminder of the foundation our family was built on. And then it was shattered. I glanced up toward the altar. Kevin wasn't watching his bride with tears in his eyes. He was looking at his watch. He caught my eye and gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that clearly said, "Let's get this show on the road." The warmth of the moment vanished, replaced by a familiar chill. The spell was broken. Jessica took a deep breath, composed herself, and her radiant smile returned, but this time it looked a little less genuine. I placed her hand in the crook of my arm, and we began the long walk. With every step, I felt like I was leading her away from the legacy of love her mother and I had built, and handing her over to a man who saw this sacred moment as just another item on his schedule to be checked off. The ceremony was a blur of rehearsed vows and polite applause. Afterward, during the reception, the true performance began. Kevin, with Jessica on his arm, moved through the crowd like a politician, shaking hands, laughing too loudly, his eyes constantly scanning the room. I knew who he was looking for. And then he saw him. A man in his 50s with a tailored suit and an air of quiet authority had just walked in. Kevin's posture straightened, his smile tightened. It was his boss, David Sterling. Kevin practically dragged Jessica and me across the marble floor. "Mr. Sterling, so glad you could make it." Kevin gushed, his voice a full octave higher than usual. He introduced Jessica, who gave a charming, practiced smile. Then Kevin turned his attention to me. He took a half-second to glance at my simple suit, a flicker of something like shame in his eyes. He put a hand on my back, a gesture that felt less like an inclusion and more like he was presenting an exhibit. "And this, Mr. Sterling," Kevin announced, his voice carrying to the nearby tables, "is my father-in-law, Walter Hayes." He paused for dramatic effect, a smirk playing on his lips as he delivered the punchline he thought was so clever. He's an unemployed loser, but he has a good heart." The words dropped into the cheerful atmosphere like a stone into a silent pond. The polite chatter around us sputtered and died. I saw my cousin Martha's jaw drop. I felt the heat of a dozen pairs of eyes suddenly on me, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Jessica's face went pale, the color draining from her cheeks, as if she'd been struck. Her perfect smile crumbled, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. She looked at Kevin, then at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. But I wasn't looking at her. I wasn't looking at the whispering guests. I was looking straight at Kevin, my expression unreadable. I let him see the full weight of my disappointment, the quiet finality of a line being crossed. And then I shifted my gaze to the most important man in the room. David Sterling wasn't laughing. He wasn't embarrassed or confused. Instead, a slow, deliberate smile spread across his face. It was not a kind smile. It was sharp, intelligent, and utterly lethal. His eyes met mine over Kevin's oblivious head, and in that silent, shared glance, a 30-year-old secret was about to come roaring back to life. In the ringing silence that followed Kevin's little joke, I did not get angry. The anger had been a slow burn over the past few months, but in that moment of public humiliation, it finally burned itself out, leaving behind something cold, heavy, and clear. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me, the kind of peace that comes when you know exactly what you have to do. The whispers from the surrounding tables faded into a dull hum. The shocked and pitiful expression on my daughter's face became a blurry watercolor. The only two people in the world who were in sharp focus were my new son-in-law and the man standing next to him. I looked at David Sterling. His smile remained a thin, knowing line. His eyes, however, were not smiling. They were fixed on me, and in them I saw 30 years of shared history of risks taken, of battles won. I saw the memory of late nights in a dusty garage sketching out business plans on a whiteboard. I saw the handshake we shared when we landed our first major contract. I saw the mutual respect that had been the bedrock of our friendship and our enterprise for decades. I gave him the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the signal he needed. Then I turned my full attention back to Kevin, who was now beginning to look uncomfortable under the weight of the unending silence. I kept my voice perfectly level, devoid of any anger or accusation. "Kevin," I said, my words cutting cleanly through the quiet room. "Are you absolutely certain that's how you want to introduce me?" It was not a threat. It was not a challenge. It was a lifeline. It was one final, unmerited act of grace, a chance for him to take it all back, to blame the champagne, to apologize, to show a single shred of self-awareness. It was an open door inviting him to step back from the cliff's edge. He didn't see the door. He didn't even see the cliff. He saw my calmness as weakness. He saw my question as the confused rambling of an old man. A wave of relieved, boisterous laughter erupted from his chest. "Oh, come on, Walter, don't be so serious," he boomed, slapping me on the back in a gesture of forced camaraderie. "It was just a little roast, a joke, to break the ice." He turned to David Sterling, gesturing to me as if presenting a court jester. "See, Mr. Sterling, he's a good sport. Takes a joke." He went on digging his own grave with the cheerful cluelessness of a man who thinks he's found treasure. He started telling some other vapid story, trying to steer the conversation back to himself. But I wasn't listening anymore. I had offered him a chance to show his character, and he had shown it. I felt a pang of pity for him, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of duty. A duty to my daughter to protect her from a man with such catastrophic judgment. A duty to my company to protect it from a man who could not tell the difference between an asset and the man who owned it. And a duty to my late wife's memory to honor the values we had built our entire world upon. The time for lifelines was over. The time for consequences had begun. As Kevin's loud, oblivious laughter echoed in the silent room, the scene in front of me seemed to fade. The crystal glasses, the lavish floral arrangements, the strained faces of the guests, it all blurred into a hazy backdrop. For a few seconds, I wasn't in a country club ballroom. I was 30 years younger, standing in the cold, damp air of a two-car garage that smelled of oil, sawdust, and ambition. I saw a younger version of myself, sleeves rolled up, hunched over a cluttered workbench, sketching out complex logistical frameworks on a large sheet of paper. Across from me was a younger David Sterling, not in a tailored suit, but in a worn-out sweatshirt, pacing back and forth, practicing a sales pitch to the garage door. He was the voice. I was the engine. He was the charismatic face that could sell ice in the Arctic. I was the quiet architect who designed the delivery system. That's how Apex Solutions was born. Not in a boardroom, but with two best friends, a shared dream, and a belief that we could build something that would last. My mind then shifted to a quieter, more painful memory. My wife Clara in the final year of her life. We were sitting on our porch, the same porch where Jessica had defended Kevin. Clara's hand was frail in mine, but her gaze was as strong as ever. "Walter," she had said, her voice soft but firm. "This company, this money, don't let it become a cage for our Jessie. I want her to find someone who loves her when she has nothing. Someone who sees the value in her heart, not in her inheritance." I made her a promise that day. I promised that I would do everything in my power to give our daughter a chance at a real, genuine love unburdened by the weight of wealth. 5 years ago, after I lost her, I kept that promise. I called David into my office, the one with the panoramic view of the city, and I told him my plan. I was stepping down as CEO. I was handing him the reins, the title, the public face of the company I had built. He thought I was retiring. I had to explain that I was simply disappearing from view. I would retain my 70% ownership. I would remain the chairman of the board. But to the world, and more importantly to my daughter's future suitors, I would become just Walter Hayes, a quiet man living on a modest pension in a small house. It was an experiment, a silent test. I wanted to see if the values Clara and I had instilled in our daughter would lead her to a man of character. The memory faded, and the loud, garish ballroom snapped back into focus. I saw Kevin still talking, still trying to impress the man he thought held his future in his hands. I saw my daughter, her face a mask of confusion and pain. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that my experiment was over. The results were in. And it was a bitter, resounding failure. I had tried to protect my daughter from the cage of wealth, but in my absence she had willingly walked into the arms of a man who was nothing but a gilded cage himself. The promise I made to my dying wife could only be fulfilled in one way now, not by staying silent, but by finally showing the world who I really was. I returned from my memories to the sound of Kevin's voice still prattling on, utterly oblivious. He had moved on from his joke and was now trying to impress David with some story about a recent sales conference. I gave David the nod he had been waiting for. It was time. David's sterling smile, which had been a thin, sharp line, finally widened. It was a predator's smile, the kind that appears just before the final strike. He took a deliberate step forward, gently interrupting Kevin's monologue, and placed a hand on my shoulder. It was a gesture of profound respect, of solidarity, and it immediately shifted the center of gravity in the room. Everyone fell silent, sensing that the real event was about to begin. Kevin looked confused. "Mr. Sterling?" he asked, his voice faltering. David ignored him for a moment, his eyes fixed on me with warmth and respect. Then he turned his gaze to Kevin, and the warmth vanished, replaced by a stare as cold and hard as granite. "Kevin," David began, his voice calm, clear, and carrying across the silent hall. "I have a question for you. For the past 5 years, you've received a paycheck from Apex Solutions twice a month. Is that correct?" Kevin blinked, thrown off balance. Yes, sir. Of course." "And have you ever looked at the signature on those checks, Kevin?" David asked, his voice dangerously soft. "The signature at the bottom of the document that authorizes the transfer of hundreds of thousands of dollars into your bank account over the years." A flicker of panic appeared in Kevin's eyes. He had no idea where this was going, but he knew it was a place he didn't want to be. I can't say that I have, sir. It's all direct deposit now." "A shame," David said, his smile returning, but this time it was all teeth. "Because if you had, you would have seen the name Walter H. Hayes signed on every single one of them." The name hung in the air. I watched as Kevin's brain struggled to process the information. The confident, smug expression on his face began to crumble, replaced by a slack-jawed, dawning horror. He looked from David to me, and back again, his face turning a sickly shade of pale. The whispers in the room grew into a low, shocked murmur. David wasn't finished. He let the revelation sink in for a few agonizing seconds before he continued, his voice rising with righteous authority. You see, Kevin, you just stood here in front of your new bride, your family, and your colleagues, and you introduced the man who signs your checks as an unemployed loser. He took another step closer, his voice dropping to a low, lethal growl. You just insulted the founder of Apex Solutions. You just insulted the majority owner of Apex Solutions. You just insulted the chairman of the board of Apex Solutions. With each title, it was as if David was landing a physical blow. You haven't just shown a stunning lack of respect, Kevin. You have demonstrated a level of catastrophic poor judgment that I cannot and will not tolerate within my organization. Then came the final devastating act of theater. David Sterling, the powerful CEO, turned his back on the humiliated groom and faced me directly. He straightened his tie, and his entire demeanor shifted to one of profound deference. Mr. Chairman, he said, his voice now formal and respectful, do I have your permission to proceed? The entire room held its breath. All eyes were on me, the unemployed loser. I looked at the shattered man who had married my daughter. I looked at my daughter, her face a storm of confusion and tears. I gave David a slow, deliberate nod. David turned back to Kevin, his expression now one of utter finality. You're fired, he said, the two words landing like gunshots in the silent room. Clear out your desk on Monday morning. Security will escort you from the building. We will have your personal effects mailed to you. A collective gasp swept through the hall. Kevin just stood there, swaying slightly, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound coming out. His perfectly planned wedding, his meticulously crafted image, his entire future had just been demolished by a joke. And all I could do was stand there in the wreckage he had created and wonder how I was going to explain all of this to my daughter. The two words, "You're fired," echoed in the sudden tomb-like silence of the grand ballroom. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody breathed. It was as if time itself had frozen. Then the silence shattered, not with a bang, but with 1,000 whispers. The sound was like dry leaves skittering across pavement, a rustle of gossip and scandal that spread through the room like a contagion. I saw guests turning to each other, their faces a mixture of shock and delicious excitement. They were witnessing the best kind of drama, real, raw, and utterly ruinous for someone else. Kevin stood at the epicenter of it all, a statue of disbelief. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, translucent sheen. His mouth hung open, and he blinked rapidly, as if trying to wake himself from a nightmare. His eyes, wide and terrified, finally found mine. He took a staggering step forward, his hand outstretched, not in anger, but in a desperate, pathetic plea. "Walter," he stammered, his voice a choked, unrecognizable whisper. No, this is a joke, right? A prank. Tell him, Walter. Please, tell your friend to stop." I said nothing. I simply held his gaze, letting him see the vast, empty chasm that now lay between us. I was no longer his father-in-law. I was a stranger, a force of nature he had foolishly provoked. The man he was begging for help was the very man he had just tried to destroy. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. He turned to David, his composure finally cracking completely. "Mr. Sterling, I don't understand. I'm one of your top performers. We can talk about this. Whatever I said, I apologize." David simply looked at him with an expression of mild disgust, as if observing an insect. But my attention was no longer on either of them. It was on my daughter. Jessica pushed her way toward me, her beautiful white dress seeming to wilt around her. Her face was a storm of conflicting emotions, shock, horror, betrayal, and a deep soul-crushing confusion. Her eyes, filled with tears, were locked on mine. The whispers, the drama, Kevin's pathetic pleading, none of it mattered anymore. The central conflict in the room had changed. It was now just the two of us, a father and a daughter, standing in the wreckage of a secret that had finally come to light. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. What is he talking about? Founder chairman of the board. What is going on? Her question wasn't just about the words. It was about the 28 years of her life that had preceded them. It was about the small house, the old car, the stories of a simple retirement. It was about the man she thought she knew. I ignored Kevin completely, turning my body to face my daughter, creating a physical barrier between her and the man she had just married. I took her hands in mine. They were ice cold. Jessica, listen to me. I said, my voice low and steady, trying to anchor her in the swirling chaos. This is not the time or the place to explain everything, but I need you to know that I never lied to you. But you did, she cried, pulling her hands away. My whole life. You let me believe. You let him. She couldn't finish the sentence. She gestured helplessly at Kevin, who was now being spoken to in low, firm tones by two discreet but imposing men in dark suits who had appeared as if from nowhere. I let you believe that character was more important than money. I said, my heart aching with the weight of it all. I did it to protect you. It was a promise I made to your mother. Before I could say more, David stepped in quietly, his voice a calm authority in the storm. Walter, we should go. My car is waiting. He then nodded to the security team. Gentlemen, I believe Mr. Price's presence is no longer required at this event. Kevin didn't even fight. The defiance had drained out of him, leaving an empty, broken shell. He allowed himself to be gently but firmly guided toward an exit, his head bowed in utter defeat. As he was led away, I looked at my daughter. Her face streaked with tears, standing alone at her own wedding reception. The man she had married was gone. The father she thought she knew had been replaced by a powerful stranger. The problem of Kevin had been solved, but the problem of Jessica and me, that was just beginning. As the two security men gently but firmly escorted a broken, stammering Kevin toward the exit, I did not watch him go. In my mind, he had already vanished. He was a ghost. A bad decision. A lesson learned far too late. He no longer existed. The only person in the entire world who mattered was standing in front of me, her face a beautiful, tragic canvas of tears and betrayal. The whispers of the guests, the half-eaten plates of expensive food, the ridiculously extravagant floral arrangements, it was all just noise. The real story was here in the devastated eyes of my daughter. I took a step closer to her, and she flinched, a small, involuntary movement that pierced my heart. I kept my voice soft, but I would not let it waver. This was not the time for weakness. It was the time for a truth that was 30 years overdue. Jessica. I began, my voice thick with a sorrow that had nothing to do with the scene that had just unfolded. I am so sorry. Not for what just happened to him. He earned every second of that. I am sorry for the secret I had to keep from you. She shook her head, a tear flying from her cheek. A secret, Dad, my entire life. It was a lie. No. I said, my voice firm but gentle. It was a promise I made to your mother before she passed. I reached out, and this time she let me take her hand. Your mother and I, we wanted you to grow up without the weight of money on your shoulders. We didn't want it to shape you, to corrupt you, or to make you a target. We wanted you to be loved for who you are, for your kind heart and your brilliant mind, not for the balance in a bank account you never knew existed. I looked into her confused, searching eyes, praying she would understand. So I ran an experiment, a father's clumsy, foolish attempt to give his daughter the one thing all the money in the world can't buy, a chance at finding real, genuine love. I stepped back. I lived quietly, and I waited for you to find a man who loved Jessica Hayes, not the heiress to Apex Solutions. My voice broke on the last words. I watched him, honey. I listened to his speeches about money and status. I saw how he dismissed everything that was real and good. And tonight, he didn't just show me his true character. He announced it to the world. The beautiful, expensive party died a slow, awkward death. The string quartet faded out mid-song, their bows hovering uncertainly over their instruments. Guests who had been enjoying the free champagne and gourmet food just an hour earlier now avoided our eyes, mumbling flimsy excuses as they gathered their coats and fled into the night. The room, which had been a vibrant theater of celebration, was now just a large, silent hall filled with half-eaten plates and wilting flowers. It was the sad, quiet aftermath of a battle nobody had expected. David Sterling, ever the loyal friend, handled the logistics of the fallout, with quiet efficiency, speaking in low tones to the venue manager. My focus, however, remained on Jessica. She stood beside me, wrapped in a silence that was heavier than any words. But the quiet was shattered one last time. Kevin, having apparently broken away from his security escort, came stumbling back into the hall, his face a desperate, blotchy mess. He made a direct line for us, his eyes wild. He ignored Jessica and directed his frantic, babbling plea to me. "Walter, Mr. Hayes, please, you can't do this. I was wrong, I was stupid. It was a terrible joke, I can fix this, I swear." He then turned to David, his voice cracking. "Mr. Sterling, please, my whole career, I'll do anything." David didn't even grant him a glance. He simply shook his head and turned away, a silent and absolute dismissal. Seeing that wall of indifference, the last bit of Kevin's manufactured charm curdled into pure venomous spite. His desperation twisted into rage, and he turned on the only person left he thought he could hurt. He turned on my daughter. "This is your fault," he hissed, his voice a low, ugly snarl. "All of it. If you had just told me who your father was, if you weren't so secretive about your pathetic little family, none of this would have happened. You set me up." I tensed, ready to step in, but I held myself back. This was a moment that belonged to Jessica. I watched her face as she absorbed his words, and I saw something incredible happen. The hurt, the confusion, the heartbroken tears, they all receded. In their place, a cold, hard clarity began to form in her eyes. It was the look of a person seeing the absolute, unvarnished truth for the first time. She wasn't looking at the ambitious, charming man she thought she loved. She was looking at a weak, cowardly boy who blamed a woman for his own catastrophic failures. She was seeing the real Kevin, and she was not impressed. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her left hand. With her right, she grasped the large, ostentatious diamond ring he had been so proud of. She pulled it from her finger. There was no hesitation, no trembling. It was a single fluid motion of finality. She took a step toward him and held out the ring. "You're right," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "This was my fault. I made a terrible mistake in judgment." She opened his limp, unresisting hand and dropped the ring into his palm. "Now get out of my sight." 3 days after the wedding, that wasn't the world was quiet again. The furious phone calls from Kevin's parents had stopped. The gossip among the guests had likely moved on to the next scandal. All the noise and chaos had receded, leaving only the truth sitting quietly between my daughter and me too. We were on the back porch of my small house, the same porch where she had defended him just a week earlier. The air was warm, and the only sounds were the gentle creak of the old wooden swing and the distant hum of cicadas. Jessica had been silent for a long time, staring out at the simple green lawn that Kevin had once found so unimpressive. Her eyes were puffy and red, but for the first time in months they were clear. The spell was broken. Finally, she turned to me, and the apology that came was more than just words. It was a torrent of regret that she had been holding back for days. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "I'm so sorry. For everything. For not listening to you. For being so blind. I defended him over and over. I thought his ambition was strength, and I thought your quiet life was—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't have to. I knew what she meant. She was apologizing, not just for her choice in a husband, but for her judgment of her own father. He made me feel like your values were old-fashioned, she continued, like your life was something to be embarrassed of, and I fell for it. I am so ashamed. I pulled her into a hug, letting her cry on my shoulder. There was no triumph in me, no satisfaction in being right. There was only the deep, aching love of a father for his child. Shh, I said softly, stroking her hair. There's nothing to be ashamed of. We both learned an expensive lesson. I pulled back to look her in the eye. I'm sorry too, honey. My experiment, my secret. It was a clumsy way to try and protect you, and it put you in an impossible position. I never wanted to hurt you. She wiped her eyes, taking a shaky breath. But when she spoke again, her voice had a new hard edge of resolve that I hadn't heard before. I spoke to a lawyer this morning, she said, her gaze steady. I'm filing for an annulment. The marriage was a fraud. The man I married didn't exist. He wasn't a partner. He was a salesman, and his entire character was a lie. I nodded, a wave of pride washing over me. This was my daughter. Not the blushing bride in the designer dress, but this strong, clear-eyed woman sitting next to me, taking control of her own life. I'll support you in any way you need, I told her. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and we sat in silence for a while, watching the sun begin to set. The wedding was a disaster. Her heart was broken. But as we sat there on the porch of the small house built on a foundation of love and integrity, I knew that for the first time in a long time we were finally beginning to feel something real again. 6 months passed. The seasons began to turn, and with them so did our lives. The annulment was finalized quietly and without contest. Kevin, I heard, had moved to another state, a disgraced man looking for a fresh start. But I rarely thought of him. My thoughts were focused on the future, a future that was being rebuilt piece by piece in the most unexpected of places. I found my daughter not in a fancy boutique or a high-end salon, but in the noisy, chaotic, and wonderfully vibrant hall of a downtown youth center. She was wearing an old t-shirt with a paint smudge on the cheek, helping a young girl with her homework, laughing at something the child had said. The foundation my company had started years ago funded this center, a fact Jessica had discovered on her own. She hadn't asked me for a job. She had simply shown up and asked if they needed a volunteer. I watched her for a few minutes before she saw me, and my heart swelled with a pride that was deeper than any business success I had ever known. The lost, confused bride was gone. In her place was a woman who was animated, confident, and filled with a sense of purpose that no amount of money could ever buy. She finally looked up and saw me, and her face broke into a genuine, unforced smile. "Hey, Dad," she called out, her voice bright and clear over the happy noise of the center. "You're just in time. We're about to start the art class. I could use an assistant." I brought her the coffee I was holding, and we talked for a while, leaning against a wall covered in children's paintings. We didn't talk about the wedding. We didn't talk about Kevin. We talked about her day, about the kids, about a new mural they were planning for the outside wall. Our conversation was easy, comfortable, and honest. The painful chasm that had opened between us that night was gone, replaced by a bridge built of truth and forgiveness. She was no longer my little girl to be protected, but my daughter to be admired. Later, as I walked back to my car, I paused and looked back through the large windows of the center. I could see her surrounded by kids, a paintbrush in her hand, her face illuminated by joy. And I found myself speaking to the one person I always spoke to in the quiet moments. "Clara," I whispered to the evening air, "you would be so proud of her." She found her way back, and I thought of the storm we had weathered, the ugly, necessary chaos of it all. "I kept my promise, my love. It turns out sometimes a storm is exactly what's needed to wash away the trash and give something beautiful and strong a chance to finally grow." A genuine smile touched my lips, a feeling of peace settling deep in my bones. The world was back in its proper order, not because a bad man was punished, but because a good woman had finally found her true worth. And that was a fortune greater than any I had ever built. This story is a powerful reminder that true worth is not measured by a job title or a bank account, but by the quiet integrity of character. We often chase the illusion of success, forgetting that a person's value is revealed not in moments of triumph, but under pressure. Kevin's world collapsed not from one mistake, but from a foundation of arrogance. True strength, as Walter demonstrated, lies in patience and unwavering values. The most painful truths often lead to the most profound healing, clearing away the superficial to reveal what is truly important, a life built on respect and authenticity. What do you believe is the true measure of a person's worth? Share your thoughts in the comments below.